This is Boomer Life on CL 650.
It's the most wonderful time of the year.
Welcome back. This is Boomer Life on CL 650. Joining us in the studio today from the BC Seniors Living Association, we have Executive Director Marlene Williams, along with Carol Holmes, the President, and our Vice President is with us today as well, Tony Baina. So thank you for joining us. We've been discussing a report that was recently sent to the provincial government from the BC Seniors Living Association about speaking the same language when we speak about seniors in this province and providing proper support, proper housing accommodations and new communities, and making sure that everybody's on the same page. We've talked about clarifying definitions of independent living and assisted living. And Tony, you've mentioned a couple of times that Alberta has set some really good examples and that their policies are very different than what we have in British Columbia. What can you tell us about that, and why is it that much better in Alberta?
Sure. Well, I think it's a different model in Alberta, definitely, and I think it's a little bit more consumer friendly or resident friendly. In British Columbia, we have a very strict definition of what a home is. It's really, people think of it as the place where the person has lived for most of their life. In Alberta, that's a little bit more expansive. A home is wherever the senior turns the key in the lock, and that could be a property or a community where they live. And then what they do is they say once the person, we've defined what the home is, which is anywhere, is they can get services there, and they don't have the legislative limits that we have here with the 2 prescribed services. They actually allow for more services than we currently provide in British Columbia. Hence, there isn't that need or that requirement in Alberta for a senior to change the location where they live in order to get the services where they live. As long as the operator is able to provide that service, they can get that in the home. So when a resident moves from their maternal or paternal home to a property, they can make a decision based on what can this new home provide me in terms of services. And if they feel they're going to need 2 prescribed services, 3 prescribed services, or more, they'll make that choice. So it's really, that's the difference versus British Columbia. In British Columbia too, in all provinces, when the decision is made to move into a property, it's really reactive. And so families think about the here and now, and residents think of the here and now versus what am I going to need 1, 2, 3, 4 years from now.
This is a very good point,
right.
Because just traditionally that we hear from, our friends, neighbors, even in our own homes, we wait a little bit too long. And when you suggest being reactive, it's like, geez, mom needs help now or soon. Mm-hmm. And I guess we fail to look at a bigger picture.
Correct. And of course in Alberta, the model's a bit more forgiving because you can make that, you can say, okay, I'm going to move mom into property A, knowing that property A can take care of her needs irrespective of what they are.
As she progresses, whether she lives 4 years or 24 more years.
Whereas in British Columbia, you may make the decision based on the property in your neighborhood without realizing that they can only go so far before then you have to move mom or dad again. And so, that's where I think the Alberta model has some benefit from a consumer point of view and from a senior's point of view in terms of being offering what it is that they need in the long term.
So you've actually asked the government to change the definition of home in this report.
Yes, we've asked them to not be so when they talk about programs at home, they're really thinking about where the person has lived most of their life, and we're saying to them, broaden that definition so that it does include wherever they put the key in the lock, and that could be a property. So and also consider that in terms of, for example, one of the programs that we identified in this report is when a senior goes to hospital and they have to return to home, a number of the health authorities will provide home support services for them if they return to their home where they've lived all their life. But if they're living in an independent living property or an assisted living property, they don't consider it their home, and so that support isn't provided to them. Even more interestingly, sometimes when a senior is in hospital, rather than returning them to their home, it may be more appropriate to return them to or have them stay in an independent living property or an assisted living property and receive their care services there, because they're in a congregated environment and they're with professionals who understand their needs.
Right, so almost like a stepping stone.
Yes.
And this is a topic that we've actually engaged in some dialogue with government on. It is absolutely possible to provide a respite type environment in independent living, but we have to change the regulations and make them more flexible so that we can accommodate the needs. I mean, we talked about people who are in the acute care hospital. I mean, seniors, very high prevalence of falls, for example. So they're admitted to the emergency ward, they've broken their hip, they end up having a hip replacement or the fracture repaired. They're in an acute care bed. 13% of acute care beds in British Columbia every year are taken up by people who are there way too long, and we refer to them as alternate level of care clients. And so many of them are seniors waiting to go somewhere that's more appropriate, where they can get the type of convalescent care or rehabilitation that they require.
Or waiting to go back to their own home.
Or waiting to go back to their own home, but because they live alone and there's nobody there to take care of them, it's not a safe environment to go to. We can provide that kind of convalescent or respite service within a housing environment as soon as we change the regulations.
Well, actually, I'm really glad that you clarified that, because I had a friend whose senior husband, was living in an independent living property in a community and had to be hospitalized for whatever reason. His needs became greater while he was in the hospital, and he never left the hospital. They wouldn't send him back to what they considered his home, where he turned the lock and key. It was an independent living, but he had greater needs now, and they had nowhere to keep him, and he stayed in the hospital for 9-10 months.
Yeah, it's with seniors especially, it's use it or you lose it. So if they're not up mobilizing, if they're not moving around and getting exercise and things like that, then their joints and their bones will seize up on them, and then when they could lose their independence completely as a result of lying in a bed on a prolonged basis in an acute care hospital.
And in the case of your the example you gave, in that particular case, it could be that particular person, let's say they already have the 2 prescribed services. Now all of a sudden, because of their hospital stay, they need a third service.
They needed physio.
And by definition, all of a sudden, we can't take them back into our property because they're now deemed residential care or long-term care.
BC provincial
legislation. In Alberta, we could take them back and provide those services through a third-party operator or even through the health authority if needed. But in British Columbia, because they've now slipped into that third prescribed services, now all of a sudden the hospital has to find them either a long-term care bed or leave them in hospital. And a long-term care bed for someone convalescing who might be perfectly mobile other than that need is probably not the right place either, because everybody around them are more complex. And as you know, and Carol just alluded to it, we really emulate what's around us. And so, if I'm in a complex care environment, I see everybody has walkers and has and is in wheelchairs. My recovery may be somewhat hindered because the surrounding population is showing me something different than if I'm in an independent living building, where everybody walks. They've got activities that require me to get up and be about. So I think that's what we're trying to advocate to government, to say, look, take a look at that as an alternative. And
Carol, did you actually have statistics of how many seniors are living long-term and filling up the hospital beds?
Well, it's 13% of acute care hospital days every year are taken up with alternate level of care. So I mean, the ramifications for Joe Q Public is that your hip replacement is not going to happen. Yeah. You're going to wait 6 months because there's no beds for you to come in. People's surgeries are canceled because beds are not available, and oftentimes it's because people are inappropriately housed there waiting for some other service.
And what about eligibility for support? Does that differ between provinces?
It does. In Alberta, home support is available to anybody who needs it wherever they need it. So there's no eligibility criteria. You contact Alberta Health Services, you let them know you need home support, and they provide it. Whether you're living in a single-family home, or whether you're in a senior's apartment, or whether you're in a retirement community.
And Tony, you mentioned earlier about it all comes down to making a real estate decision. Mm-hmm. Explain that.
Well, I think right now the way the system works is that Home is best, or some of the home support is really being viewed as providing it within a person's home. And not thinking about that home could be in a property that's independent living. And we really have to get to the point where it doesn't matter where the senior decides to call their home, that those services should be available to them. There shouldn't be a prejudice just because they're in a property that all of a sudden that they're not eligible for this kind of support. The Alberta model, again, doesn't matter where that home is,
it's
what
just
they
where
call
you turn
home,
the key.
where they turn the key, and do they need it? And that's what we're looking for.
Well, it may all sound very confusing, but it's actually not. You've simplified a lot of it for us. Thanks so much. You are listening to Boomer Life on CL 650, and joining us in the studio today from the BC Seniors Living Association, we have Executive Director Marlene Williams, we have the President Carol Holmes, and we have Vice President Tony Baina. If you want more information, please visit the website bcsla.ca. We'll continue this conversation in a moment on CL 650.
Celebrating the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CL 650.